Afternoon. Perfect timing. Now, good afternoon, everybody. It's now afternoon, so we can go and get started. My name is Scout Fenema. I co-host the Water and Law Policy Committee for NWRA along with Julian Cordero. Today, we have an amazing speaker that's going to come talk to us about something we haven't really covered in this group so far. You know, when we start these meetings off, I really like to kind of start off with what are the goals of these meetings? What are we hoping to accomplish, and how are we actually going to get there? So when we first developed this committee, the Water and Law Policy Committee, one of the first things that we did is we came up with this idea of we should have some goals and some objectives to actually get to those goals. The goal of this group is to create a space for legal experts, regulators, operators, and researchers to collaborate and to generate growth opportunities that enhance water management in Nevada. Now, we said we were going to do this by bringing three pieces together. First, let's get the experts. Let's open up a space where we can have open discussions with these experts. And then let's try to bring these together in a way that we can actually hopefully collaborate and build a showcase of these experts so that we can continue to learn about water and land policy through collaborative space. So in the effort to meet these goals, we defined a couple topics that were interesting to the group. One of the topics was conjunctive management. Another topic was the multi-level policy implementation. Now, so far, throughout this whole entire presentation series that we've been talking about water management in terms of, this conjunctive management and the multi-level policy and management. You can almost think about it in terms of a watershed where you've got, the upstream decision makers, you've got the midstream people making the decisions that affect the water, but we also have the downstream effect of that management. So far in this kind of context, we've had Jake Tibbetts come talk to us about managing water and the impacts of conjunctive management in Diamond Valley. Really, Jake was focused on that midstream impact. He's that interface between the users downstream and the decision makers up above him. The next, we had Jeff Fontaine come and talk to us as well, kind of more focused on that middle section of water management, with also touching a little bit higher up into that decision-making realm of that upstream decision process. Then Alan Hanston came and talked to us, the general manager for the Northside company up in Idaho, who's really talking about how on a day-to-day basis you can actually manage and implement conjunctive management, really midstream. Then Caitlin came and talked to us and really gave us an overview of what does conjunctive management look like across the entire West. Now, today, we're actually going to focus on the downstream impacts. With that, I'd like to introduce Amy Quandt, who's an associate professor at San Diego State, who's going to be talking to us about the downstream impacts of what is it like and how are stakeholders impacted by things such as conjunctive management or groundwater management recharge. Now, with that, I would like to thank Amy for coming and giving us a talk, but I also do want to clearly give credit to Carly and Lori as well from the Environmental and Conservation Committee. This is a joint presentation that we are both our committees came together to offer this up. Amy's talk is not just interesting from a water management perspective, but also from a conservation and really a stakeholder's perspective. So with that, I'd like to kick it off to Amy and let her take it away. Thanks, Amy.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me get my screen up. All right. Just holler at me if you can't hear me or see me at any point. Yeah, so today I'm excited to be here. I'm an associate professor at San Diego State, so we're, I guess, going on a little field trip to California today, but hopefully there's still some relevant lessons learned from what's going on here that you all can learn from. And I have some discussion questions at the end, and I will certainly not take up the entire hour, so hopefully I have time to ask questions, chat about that. I'm going to be talking about my research over the last 5 years, which has really been looking at kind of these topics that were introduced as far as managing groundwater and groundwater policies, and then what that looks like for repurposing land when there's no longer enough water to farm there. And my work is specifically focused in the San Joaquin Valley of California, so think the southern Central Valley. And as a social scientist, I explore these topics through talking to people who are producers, who are managing land, and all of that. And I'll get into my methods in a second. Um, but before I do so, I just want to acknowledge this is not just me. We have faculty who've worked on different phases of this project from UC Santa Barbara and San Diego State, as well as across the border in Mexico. Graduate students, undergrad students, and this work's been funded by two different USDA grants, as well as kind of an internal San Diego State grant. And then I need to especially thank the 43 people who I somehow convinced to sit down and do an interview with me as part of this work. So huge thanks to them. And this is, it's the kind of their perspectives is mostly what I'll be sharing today. Just brief outline, talk about some of the big questions we've been asking, provide a little bit of context about California and our study area, at least at a very high level, and then go through our methods. So we did 3 different rounds of interviews, as well as 2 rounds of kind of a newspaper analysis to look at kind of the broader perspectives in the region. And I'm going to focus, as was said, on perspectives on sustainable groundwater management and SGMA regulations in California, which I'll explain here in a second. Spend quite a bit of time looking at different land repurposing options and dive into groundwater recharge and habitat conservation because both those topics came up a lot in our work. So it's kind of the focus. The two kind of big questions we've been asking for the last 5 years are what are stakeholder perspectives on the impacts of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act? So what do people think about now managing groundwater in California when before it was kind of the Wild West of not being managed, and then specifically how retired land can be repurposed to minimize harms while maximizing benefit. So if, there's no longer water to farm that piece of property, what can be done with it that can maximize benefits and minimize harms? And I mean that economically, environmentally, kind of all the different ways you can look at it. And this work's already been published in a few different academic publications. So I have that there too if you want to nerd out on the details. Um, Water in California. So that we're not here for an entire month explaining water in California. It's a very highly engineered system, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, that moves water around the state. In the San Joaquin Valley specifically, with less surface water available due to drought and other things, a lot of farmers and communities have been relying more and more on groundwater. Over the last several decades, groundwater pumping has increased, and this has also led to a lot of issues like the high cost and energy use of pumping groundwater, poor water quality, degraded ecosystems, and then severe land subsidence where the land has lowered because we've pumped all the water out of it. And those are just to name a few as far as some of the negative impacts of water. And while surface water has been regulated in California for over a century, right? Groundwater wasn't really. So with a lot of these kind of negative impacts seen, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. And basically what this did was designate specific parts of California or specific basins that were really overdrafting. They were taking out a lot more water from the ground than was going back into it. And it was these critically overdrafted basins that are now regulated to meet groundwater sustainability by 2040. So there is somewhat of a long time frame to this, but this is really being implemented now, which is why this is a really interesting topic to look at because it's ongoing. And what's kind of unique of what California did, while this was a state, like a top-down policy, it's managed at the local level. So different basins and subbasins have formed groundwater sustainability agencies that are made up of different stakeholders. And it's those agencies that actually put together the plans, what are called groundwater sustainability plans, to meet that groundwater sustainability goal by 2040. So this is very much happening at the local level with the state kind of checking over plans and overseeing them and rejecting a lot of them, and they've been revised, but most of them are now up and running. And implementation is been underway for the last few years or so, depending on which subbasin you're talking about. However, with, actually managing groundwater, there's a bunch of different projections, but one of them is that about a 20% of irrigated agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley will basically just no longer have water to be farmed anymore, which is a huge chunk of land. So then what do you do with that land? What's the next best use? which leads us to a lot of our questions. Like I said, we focused on the San Joaquin Valley and specifically Kern County, which is where Bakersfield is. It's the southernmost part of the valley because that's the most kind of water scarce region. They've been significantly overdrafting by about 2 million acre feet of water each year. And despite this, it's still one of the most agricultural productive counties in the entire United States. Ton of tree nuts, I think almonds, pistachios, row crops like tomatoes, fruit trees, lots of vineyards, and then some fallowed land as well. So very, very agriculturally productive area, but very water scarce. So this is predicted to be kind of the most hard hit part of California when it comes to Sigma. All right, so that's a very brief context there. For our research methods, I'll walk through the three different rounds of interviews that we've done. So the first round we did was back in 2022, and these were kind of broader stakeholder interviews. So we were focused specifically on these three different types of stakeholders. So conservation practitioners, these were folks working at local, national, even international organization like conservation organizations, as well as folks managing conservation areas in our study area. We talked to water resource managers, so irrigation district managers, those types of folks, and then agricultural stakeholders. And these were, in this round of interviews, not really the farmers themselves, but more of like the Farm Bureau president and, folks that were representing agricultural groups. And not everyone fit nicely into one of these boxes, which is why I have this Venn diagram, but those are generally the three different types of folks we were reaching out to. And these interviews were mostly done over Zoom. Um, yeah. As part of the stakeholder interviews, we did ask some questions about conservation and land restoration as well. So these four photos are meant to represent kind of different ecological states in this part of California. So you have that picture on the top left is moderate shrub, high shrub on the top right, kind of a fallow field on the bottom left as far as like what a disked field would look like, and then low shrub on the bottom right. And we asked folks like, how might producers feel or what kind of perspectives or concerns might they have if this land was adjacent to their farm? So if you're still able to farm in the region, but you have a conservation project next door, what are some of the benefits you might get from that? And also what might be some of the concerns? So I'll go through those results as well. The next round of interviews that we did was the next summer, so summer of 2023, and we really focused specifically on farmers for that round of interviews. So we did some of those interviews in person in and around Bakersfield, some of them over Zoom, and we were really focusing in on their perspectives on groundwater management as well as different land repurposing options. What would they like to see happen in their region as far as how might the land be used to maximize benefits and lessen any negative impacts? And then the last round of interviews we did in the fall of 2023 was with community members more broadly, as well as community advocates. There's a lot of poor, disadvantaged communities in this part of California. So we wanted to get their perspectives as well as far as how is sustainable groundwater management impacting them? There are some communities where domestic wells no longer have water either, so they're really feeling the impacts of this also. And how are they then participating in water management to help advocate for their communities? So we did 10 community interviews as well. And then to kind of supplement our interviews, we also did a newspaper analysis of two local newspapers, the Bakersfield Californian and the Fresno Bee. The first round that we did was really looking at the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and then at different land repurposing options. We ended up with like 91 articles that a grad student then read through and analyzed and looked for what different themes came up when it came to groundwater management and land repurposing. And then the second round that we did, this was in fall in 2023 and then spring of 2024. So this was after that area had those huge atmospheric rivers that came through in the spring of 2023. So we wanted to focus in specifically on groundwater recharge and the impacts of flooding, using a similar method as far as looking at the same two newspapers and looking at what those newspapers were talking about as far as impacts of flood and people's perspectives on groundwater recharge. So that's the overview of what my team's been doing. Now to get to results. So I'll talk about some of the stakeholder perspectives on the impacts of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and then I'll go into their opinions about some of the land repurposing options. So this figure here is trying to summarize all the different ways the stakeholders talked about groundwater management, where the text in red is some of the kind of negative impacts, the text in green were some of the positive impacts, and then the text in yellow is kind of it's talked about in a mixed way, I guess. So people did talk about benefits of Sigma. One of the big ones being actually managing groundwater sustainably, and folks were acknowledging that, which was great to see. But there were concerns as well. But as far as one of the kind of surprising positive impacts is that folks talked about increased collaboration and communication between stakeholders. So that's what this quote is here. This was a quote from one of our interviewees where they told us Sigma gave a lot of opportunity for local collaboration to take place. It kind of forced the table to be built around this notion of groundwater. But landowners were only one piece of the conversation. Disadvantaged communities were also given a large voice at the table. So it's kind of a surprising impact of Sigma for me, at least, as far as it kind of helping bring people together to talk about this and to talk about groundwater management. So folks saw that as a positive. As far as negatives, a lot of the negatives were economic, expenses going up, concerns about the broader economy and farm workers and supporting industries to agriculture. Decrease in generational and family farming came up. So that's what this negative impact quote here is about. So we had a stakeholder tell us the small farmers out there are just not going to have the resources to deal with Sigma. You know, the people that have 20 acres here, 50 acres, I don't see any way they can sustain this going forward. This is just one of many regulations that are really impacting the smaller farmers out there. As far as from our farmer interviews and our newspaper analysis, we saw a lot of similar types of impacts. So financial, folks were concerned about loss of jobs, loss to the broader economy, costs rising, like cost of pumping, costs of food and water being higher. As far as environmental impacts, folks did also mention the kind of the positives of managing groundwater more sustainably. And also talked about some of the positive potential land repurposing options. So increased initiative for recharging, groundwater banking, potential habitat restoration, potential renewable energy expansion. So folks talked about some potential positive impacts on the environment. And then when it came to policy, there were still plenty of folks complaining about some of the disorganization between the state and the local groundwater sustainability agencies. There was, direction given to the agencies about what to include in their plans, but there's been a lot of back and forth, and I think that's been frustrating for some. So those were some of the financial, environmental, and kind of policy impacts that folks talked about there. When it came to community engagement in water management, folks talked a lot about a bunch of different ways that they're engaging in water management, including direct participation in the groundwater sustainability agencies. It's mandated by the state that disadvantaged communities and community members do get an official spot at the table, as well as other ways they can participate. People talked about participating in community groups, be formal or informal, going to community meetings to learn more about what's going on. There are several smaller community-based organizations or nonprofits that are helping educate community members about groundwater management. There are folks that are doing lobbying, working on elections and voting, as well as education through media and social media. And this quote here is from one of our community members, and they said, "This is a really exciting moment. It is also, it feels like a really challenging moment because there's just so much hard stuff going on." But it really could be, we could look back on, these early 2020s as the time when the ship really did begin to turn, where we've started thinking about the viability of all of us, including the fish and the trees, all of the community needs, all of the agricultural needs, other ways that we can we more responsibly use land. I think we're going to look back at this as a time when we finally started to get it. I like that quote because it's so optimistic. And I also think it speaks to kind of the moment, right? This is where, this is a turning point to decide what the landscape's going to look like in the future and what this region's going to look like in the future. And I think that's captured nicely here. All right, so that's kind of general perspectives on water management when we're looking more at land repurposing, and I'll dive into each of these topics a little more. These were some of the main topics that came up in our stakeholder interviews. So folks talked about, on land that can no longer be farmed anymore, we could do habitat restoration. Solar farms are going in. We could focus more on grazing and less on like intensive agriculture. Groundwater recharge came up a lot. Temporary fallowing and then recreation and parks were some of the top ones mentioned by the folks that we interviewed for the stakeholder interviews. When we looked at the farmers, this is the top results from the farmer interviews. They were very similar, actually. So a lot of the farmers talked about solar, talked about groundwater recharge, especially since we did our farmer interviews in the summer of 2023 also. So this is right after the flooding and the kind of the expansion of groundwater recharge in the area. Folks talked about fallowing as an option, groundwater banking, similar to groundwater recharge, habitat restoration, and then grazing. So these are kind of the top 6 topics that came up from the farmers. So pretty similar as far as what the broader stakeholders had to say. So I do want to dive into each of these topics a little more. So solar came up a bit, and there already are some large scale solar installations in that area. Some things that were talked about is how solar can be compatible with other land uses, potentially grazing, potentially wildlife conservation, depending on how solar farms are built, obviously. But I did talk to one stakeholder who mentioned that they're working on a solar farm that's meant to be compatible with wildlife as far as having spaces in the fence for wildlife to pass through and other things like that. So it's a potential. It's basically solar is the most financially viable option as far as folks' opinions. It's an opportunity for continued profits on the land while not farming it. So this was definitely seen as mostly a positive way, positive perspective, specifically from landowners themselves. But they did have concerns about solar taking over prime agricultural land. So they didn't want to see solar going in places with the best soil or the more secure water access. There was concerns about that. So a few quotes, I'll just put these all up. We had one producer said, these farmers can see that, and I'm not going to read all of these for each slide, but I'll read some of them. We had a producer say, these farmers can see the writing on the wall that they're not going to have enough water to farm. And so this solar is a better, highest and best use. I don't love more solar, but I understand that it's an exit strategy from irrigated agriculture that has to be considered. So I think this captures kind of both the positive financial aspects as well as some concerns about it. The newspapers talked more about solar energy broadly, as far as solar projects now generate enough energy to power more than 3 million homes, helping California meet our renewable energy goals. And the stakeholder did talk about how they've seen sheep grazing under solar panels and talked more about, grazing and solar combination there. Grazing, folks talk about this as an opportunity for some of the ecosystem benefits, like controlling weeds on land that's not being farmed anymore, potentially improving soil depending on how grazing is done. Definitely seen as compatible with other land uses like habitat restoration and the way to manage weeds on restored habitat. Grazing was generally seen fairly likably, I guess. So we had one stakeholder tell us it's a way for them to continue to make some money off that property. Weeds are non-native grasses and things like that. They get incredibly intense, and that's actually where the cattle grazing helps out. And then grazing is something that plenty of people are already doing. So a producer told us half of our land is grazing and half is in recharge ponds. And then a newspaper article said grazing is often a part of successful vegetation management. So a way to keep those, weeds under control, but also a way to make some money off the land. Fallowing. This can mean a lot of different things. So folk talked about, disking the land to keep the ground clear, to actually trying to maintain some ground cover. There were a lot of concerns about fallowing. I mean, generally fallowing is fairly common thing that farmers do. Especially in years that are more water scarce, they might fallow some of their property, just disc it to keep it clean, and then wait for the next year, which hopefully will have more rainfall. So this is something that farmers are already doing, but there are a lot of concerns for environmental and human health, especially air quality. Disking can lead to a lot of dust in the landscape, but also concerns about weeds on fallowed land and those weeds impacting neighboring farms or other things like that. As far as some of the quotes, we had one stakeholder tell us, yeah, with no interventions, we're headed for a dust bowl for sure. And it's going to be hugely detrimental to the valley if 10 to 20% of land is haphazardly retired. Then a producer said 2021, 2022 were super dry years. Everybody around here had to fallow something. We didn't have enough water. So this is just speaking to how this is already a practice that's going on, but does have, some negative environmental benefits or impacts, not benefits. Groundwater banking and groundwater recharge. This was really interesting. Folks were generally very positive about groundwater banking and recharge. So folks talked about increased interest, given recent drought year followed by major floods. So this part of California does face that kind of like weather whiplash where it can be super dry and then super wet and then super dry and super wet. So this is a way to actually capture water in those wet years to be able to use during the dry years. There already are large scale water banking going on in the area, but what people were talking about more is on farm recharge. So setting aside a little bit of land to capture the rainwater when there is more rain and recharge on farm in combination with some of these larger water banking projects. And as I mentioned, this was generally very positive, seen as a win-win option for land repurposing. So some of the quotes here, so we had a stakeholder tell us it's an actual multi-use, so it's got an exercise trail around it, and also it's full of vegetation. So I think, when it is flood, the potential for habitat for migratory birds and lots of other animals. So that could potentially be another thing that folks could do, would be to create opportunities for recharge on their land. And if you can't tell, a huge topic of all our interviews is how to how to have multiple benefits and multiple land uses on the same property. So groundwater banking was another one of those that could be compatible with restoration and conservation as well. And then a producer told us, I don't even think of it, groundwater recharge, as fallowing because it is so valuable. So this really speaks to the positive perception that producers have of this, right? If they can bank that water during wet years and use it again, they see that as a viable way to keep farming in the future. So this is also looking at our newspaper analysis as well, as far as some of the benefits of groundwater recharge and some of the constraints. Some of the benefits I already mentioned on the last slide, as far as providing water for agriculture. It can also slow rates of subsidence, potentially help raise groundwater levels and help be part of that groundwater sustainability planning. Hopefully avoid some of that land repurposing if we can recharge enough water to keep farming in certain places. It might help improve ecosystems, as one of the quotes mentioned, right? To help turn those recharge areas also into habitat. And then importantly, provide water for communities. As I mentioned, there are some communities in the region that their, domestic wells have run dry. So if there's any way to help recharge near communities specifically and provide water for those wells, that's seen as a huge benefit. Some of the constraints, this list was a little longer than the benefits here, but some people were concerned about subsidence permanently, reducing aquifer storage capacity, right? So all of the groundwater that's already been pumped out means there's less space for groundwater now. Concern about groundwater contamination and water quality. Concerns about recharge ponds attracting mosquitoes and other kind of diseases. Selecting locations for groundwater recharge can be difficult. Um, there's just not enough known about recharge, and if it can raise groundwater levels. People talk about permitting, lack of infrastructure. If there's a need to import water for groundwater recharge, that's a whole other can of worms. And then cost concerns as well. So folks, saw this generally as a positive thing, but it doesn't mean they didn't have concerns about like, how do you actually do this, and what does this look like on the landscape, like on a broader scale than it's already being done. All right, so jumping over to habitat restoration. Folks also saw habitat as a way to strategically manage the land and manage it with connectivity across the landscape so we can restore habitat in a way that maximizes um, the connectivity across the landscape. This is definitely an opportunity to do that more strategically. But there were concerns about habitat restoration as far as endangered species. A lot of farmers don't particularly want endangered species on their property. Concerns about weeds or pests negatively impacting neighboring farms or neighboring landowners. And then generally some financial concerns about habitat restoration. So concerns about costs, but not only the cost of restoration, but also the lack of jobs from habitat restoration compared to agriculture. So lack of profits, lack of jobs. And I think that sentiment was nicely summed up here by this producer quote, where a producer told us, of course, habitat restoration is fantastic, but that doesn't lend to a lot of jobs either. So not that they're saying it as bad, but just as it's not as financially viable potential as other things. Um, we had a stakeholder mention to us, if we get this right, we end up with, connected land that has been taken out of agricultural production, but that has ongoing value, that is not creating problems with invasives in the land, that is still in agricultural production. And then a newspaper article wrote, the valley can remain a thriving agricultural region amid a mosaic of new land uses like habitat corridors for the San Joaquin kit fox or wildlife-friendly areas for migratory birds. So as you can see here, there was a lot of mixed opinions about habitat restoration, and this is why we wanted to dive into it a little bit more. So as I showed you at the beginning, we had those photos of moderate shrub, high shrub, low shrub, and fallow field. And ask folks, like, what are some of the benefits that you might see from these types of landscapes and some of the concerns, especially if you're a farmer farming next to these areas. And some of the things that came up is that stakeholders did just establish like managed restoration compared to just abandoning land and letting things grow back naturally. Most of what people were talking about was actually actively restoring the land and managing it in a way that helped kind of speed up the process as far as getting it back to a more natural landscape. Poorly managed land was associated with pests, weeds, dust, disease, which is something that farmers do not want to be farming next to, right? If that land is attracting pest species to your farm, that is not a good thing for them. But well-managed land was associated with habitat, potentially with groundwater recharge, air quality, if there are other revenue options. People did talk some about bringing in beneficial insects like beneficial pollinators and other things like that. And there is some divergence between some of like the ecological benefits and then perceived agricultural risk. As you can see from this chart here, folks, the natural habitat is generally more moderate shrub in the area, so that was the one that had the most benefit. So that's kind of the blue line as far as number of stakeholders. Folks saw kind of that moderate shrub habitat as having a lot of benefits for wildlife. High shrub being a little mixed. I think there were more concerns about that kind of habitat bringing in more pests and weeds, as well as it not necessarily being as suitable of habitat for some of the endangered and native species in the region. Low shrub, it's kind of mixed. There were some concerns about how that land might be managed, and the benefits would be less compared to the moderate shrub. And then fallow field, generally a lot of concern with fallowing, as I mentioned earlier, but some benefits, especially if you are a farmer, right, and need to fallow that field to save it to farm maybe in 2 years or 3 years or whatever, there's more water down the line. So kind of mixed opinions about what different types of habitats would be more beneficial or have more concern. All right, so that's a lot of the bulk of our results. Some of the key takeaways that we found was for certain land repurposing options were more agreeable. There was more widespread agreement to the benefits. So saying like things like groundwater recharge, people mostly talked about very positively, while other ones like solar or habitat conservation were a little more not controversial, but different types of people had different perspectives on that, depending on who you were. Um, yeah, so less consensus, like I said, such as solar habitat restoration. Really, what folks talked about a lot is this is an opportunity for multi-benefit repurposing. So not only what's the one land use we can do, but how can we manage the landscape as a mosaic to maximize those benefits and minimize those harms. And, one land use can, as I mentioned multiple times, be recharge and be habitat conservation and kind of mixing those things up. As far as recommendations that folks talked about, regional planning and cross-stakeholder communication for strategic land repurposing. The word strategic came up a lot in all of our interviews. And this really being seen as an opportunity to do that type of landscape scale planning as far as maximizing benefits. So especially when it came to habitat conservation, right? Maximizing the connectivity of the land across the landscape for wildlife habitat, maximizing locations for recharge in places that will be most beneficial and be most logistically feasible given flooding and natural waterways in the area. And like I said, there's an opportunity to be strategic. Whether it will be or not is to be seen. Number two, minimizing the burden of policies that might restrict land repurposing options. So folks did bring up the Endangered Species Act as a potential concern if endangered species are on their property. That can be a problem for them potentially. And then there are some California type regulations that restrict converting agricultural land to other types of land use in order to maintain agricultural landscapes. And folks saw that as being kind of a burden if you want to take agricultural land and restore it or do something else with it. And then what came up a lot as well is financial incentives for landowners for land repurposing. Most of the land repurposing options that I mentioned, maybe besides solar, are just not going to make as much money as farming. So what is a landowner to do then, basically, especially if you're trying to convert land to habitat, there has to be some kind of financial incentive for the landowner. And not only the cost of restoration, but what's the cost of losing that agricultural income. And as you saw from the quotes, farmers were also really concerned about the broader economy, right? They're living in these communities. They don't want to see them, you know, not have jobs anymore for the farm workers or for other community members. So this was a really big concern as far as land repurposing and some of the financial incentives for landowners to do this in a strategic way, because most of the land that will be repurposed is private property. So how do we coordinate? How do we do that? How do we provide financial incentives? So those are kind of three recommendations. I did throw some questions up here as far as how to then translate this to the Nevada context, which I'm certainly way less familiar with. Getting to know California has been a challenge enough. But I have these 5 questions up here. So, how might these land repurposing options play into Nevada's conjunctive management and managing groundwater and surface water together? Things like recharge, right? How might groundwater recharge be utilized? Are these different land repurposing options viable in Nevada? How might strategic planning work in Nevada? It's certainly been challenging in California. And then similar to the financial thing, financial recommendation, what incentives might exist to prioritize habitat conservation and restoration? So I can throw these questions back up in a second, but I just want to thank everyone for listening. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions. And these photos here, the two on the outsides are at a local dairy outside of Bakersfield. And then this image in the middle is in Bakersfield. This was after 2023, so there's actually a lot of water flowing around. The Kern River actually had water in it, as well as a lot of these irrigation channels as well. But I will stop there, take questions, open it up for discussion, and I will stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic, Amy. Thank you for sharing your experience so far. Just
Yeah.
to kick off the conversation, if you think about it in terms of policy and then stakeholders getting impacted, you have the opportunity of talking to the people at the bottom that are truly being impacted. What would you recommend to, say, people designing new policy or implementing new policy in new ways, just from your experience of dealing with those that are impacted?
I mean, there certainly were plenty of folks I talked to on the ground that had a lot of negative things to say about policymakers in Sacramento and how they're kind of disconnected from these landscapes. And that's obviously a problem. As far as going to these places that are going to be impacted and actually talking to people on the ground, that takes a lot of time, and effort, but I think is something that is really important to understand what the challenges might be of enacting certain policies and what some of the potential benefits might be. Not that I think a lot of policymakers do that, but that would certainly be helpful as far as shaping something that does fit the local context a bit better than just kind of what other voters are looking for, right? Because folks in LA, folks in San Diego, folks in San Francisco and California don't know what's going on in the Central Valley. They're not a farmer, they're not there. So talking, outside of these urban areas as far as what is going on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions for Amy?
Amy, this is Reed Cousins here. I'm general manager for the Carson Water Subconserving District here in the Carson River watershed. You know,
Awesome.
the challenge is really how do you get the people to the table without some sort of punitive, excuse me, sort of punitive decision at the other end, right? If what's the carrot and what's the stick that is being applied with Sigma, which I'm not particularly
Mhm.
familiar with, but that's the challenge here is that, of course, we want people to come together and you know, the problem, understanding the problem's not the issue. It's coming to a kind of a negotiated settlement, is the preferred path. What are people doing there, I guess? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, as far as from the state's perspective, I would say it's mostly sticks as far as the incentives to like create these agencies and come up with the plans because they do. Forgetting off the top of my head what the punishment is from the state exactly, but it's mostly just all being mandated down that they run things a certain way, and part of that mandate is including community feedback, and that was one of the reasons why a lot of the first drafts of their sustainability plans were not approved, as they didn't have enough community members at the table and enough community feedback. As far as how Sigma is actually being implemented, the folks I talked to who are on these groundwater sustainability agencies still weren't entirely sure, to be honest, as far as what would work. They talked about fining folks that are pumping more groundwater out than they're allocated, but one irrigation district manager talked very candidly about how she didn't think the fines were necessarily high enough to make an impact. If you're managing like a multi-million dollar agricultural business, what's like a $500 fine? Um, so that was still a little bit challenging, and I haven't, these interviews were done a few years ago now, so I haven't talked to anyone in the last year or so as far as what's actually working to motivate folks, to implement the plans and what kind of carrots and sticks they're using. Those are just a few examples from the interviews that I can recall.
Thank you. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
that. I mean,
It's
you,
hard.
you can
Yeah.
replace you can replace dollars, but you can't ever replace water, right? I mean, it's a
Yeah.
very interesting field that we all work in.
Hmm. Definitely. Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
Lori.
Yeah.
Did you call on me?
Yes,
Okay.
please. Of course.
Hi, Amy. First
Hi.
of all, I have a background in applied anthropology
Oh, nice. Hmm.
a couple careers ago, so I really appreciate your approach. And I live in Modoc County, California, which is far
Hmm.
northeastern, like complete opposite end of the state.
Hmm.
And I'm licensed in Nevada, and I just am recently licensed in California. And I've been kind of interested and semi-involved in the the Butte County groundwater community just as an outsider looking in, and because I'm trying to learn about both states and the water issues. And I remember that in the Environmental and Conservation Committee for this organization, we had a speaker, I think it was for that one, we had a speaker about agrovoltaics.
Mhm.
And she was coming from Nye County, Nevada, but she was saying that it's actually being implemented in California. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. I think it would be a great solution for Nevada because I do a lot of work with stockwater rights. And I love the idea of the dual purpose of the
Mhm.
solar panels creating shade and also helping to prevent evapotranspiration.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the examples that I can think of were livestock and solar panels that people talked about, mostly sheep. There certainly were concerns as far as like animals messing with wiring and things like that, but also a lot of potential for the weed management benefit. So now they just kind of spray under solar panels, which is not great. So I think there's some potential for that. I think one of the problems is though a lot of the farmers are kind of leasing their land to these larger solar companies who are then coming in and installing the solar panels and doing all of that. And I'm not sure what incentives those companies have to do it in a way that can be multi-benefit, either with wildlife or with sheep. And I'm not sure what
Mm,
incentives, if any, exist for them to do it that way.
mm.
So I think that's somewhat of a
So
problem. Yeah.
yeah,
And these are
I
these
can
are mostly
see
big scale projects.
right. I can see that being an issue with
Mhm.
yeah, the people in charge of the different moving parts don't all have the same intentions or
Yeah,
goals. So yeah, I
yeah.
can see that. But it is pretty interesting anyway.
Yeah, I think there's some potential. There were folks that talked about like larger infrastructure challenges, like we don't have a substation near here. How do you then transfer all this electricity places? That certainly seems like something that at least the state of California would be interested in trying to help with, given our like energy
Mhm.
goals. But yeah, yeah. I think the problem is
Mhm.
that most folks are leasing their land, so they're not installing the solar
Gotcha.
themselves and not in charge of those kind
Okay.
of things. Yeah.
Okay. That's really
Mhm.
interesting. Thank you.
Mhm. Yep. Great. Any other questions?
All right, Amy, thank you again
Mhm.
so much for coming. And it's cool to see what's happening over the hill from us and just seeing how things differ from one state to the next, but also really incorporating that downstream impacts, what the boots on the ground said. I really enjoyed the quote of that top-down approach of, it forced us to the table, or it forced the table to
Mhm.
be built. Sometimes you need a little kick, I
Yeah.
guess, stick in this case, to actually get folks to the table to actually talk about it.
Yeah, and it certainly hasn't been a perfect process, but everyone talked about how it's better than it was as far as getting folks to talk to each other. So that is a huge benefit.
Absolutely. Well, I'll give it one more minute for any other questions, and from there, I think we might be able to wrap up.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I've got a quick slide with contact information. So this was a joint presentation again from the Law and Policy Committee as well as the Environmental and Conservation Group. So if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, any ideas for future speakers, please feel free to reach out to any of us. So from the Law and Policy side, it's myself and Julian Cardona of Vallejo. And then on the environmental and conservation side, the leaders are Carly and Lori. So thank you again for your time, everyone. Amy, grateful for your expertise and experience. And until then, we will see you all at the next meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you for the committee leaders
Mm.
putting this together for us. And if everybody can check the NWRA website, we have some other things coming up. So,
Thanks for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I did put my email in the chat. If you want to follow up with any questions, I'm more than happy.
Have a
Thank you,
great
Amy.
rest of the week, you guys.